Did we see or hear more birds? Heard them. And you know why you hear them more than see them, right? Because what's their goal in terms of being seen? To not be seen, right? You know, birds have evolved the, coloration to not be seen. But when they sing, what's the goal? To be heard, right? So you're almost always going to hear more than you see. But yet, you can take a look up here and see that it looks like most everything is things that I would expect to see out there. No, it doesn't. I don't see anything that's too terribly unusual. So you can take a look, and that gives us a little, a kind of a little look at what's out there. So, all right. So next what we're going to talk a little bit about is we're going to talk about ecology, and we're going to talk about populations. And now you've just been out there doing this. How easy do you think it is to estimate bird populations? If you were assigned to, estimate the population of birds out in this vicinity, would you think this would be trivial? Yeah. It's actually very, very difficult, isn't it? Because, again, birds move around. So, when you're counting like trees, right, there's well-established and easy mechanisms to sample, of course, and see how many trees of different types, but birds are much trickier. There's two ways people typically do it. One is to stay put for a period of time and estimate the birds in a circle around, and the other is to walk a transect and count the birds that you see. But these are still just estimates, so it's very, very hard to get a handle on bird populations. Now, this is one place where citizen science comes in, and things like eBird, because the way eBird works is you go out for a walk and you mark the birds that you see, basically on eBird, and that is data that is actually very useful for scientists, because there's people all over the world that are out there marking what they see, and it helps provide an estimate of bird populations. And other organizations too. National Audubon does, like the Christmas bird counts and feeder watch and things like that. So in this case, citizen science data often informs population estimates. Yeah?
Did you say what the difference between the eBird app and the Merlin apps is?
So Merlin is mostly oriented towards helping you identify what you see and hear. eBird, the way eBird works is you put together what are called checklists. And so a checklist is just the birds you saw on a particular outing. And there's some options you can check on whether you marked every bird you saw or not. You can count birds or just mark species seen. And then eBird saves that for you. So if you use eBird, you can build up a series of checklists of birds that you've seen, and all the checklists are marked as to where and when, which is why it's useful for citizen science, because an ornithologist can look at that and say, okay, here's a person who went walking in this area at this time of year, and here's what they saw. And so they can actually use that data to build up estimates of bird populations, which is, again, otherwise really, really pretty hard to do. So a population, again, all the individuals, a single species lives in the same place at the same time. So when ecologists study populations, they tend to look at a couple of different things. They look at population numbers. They're concerned about how many individuals there are out there. And they are interested in population genetics, right? They're interested in the genes that are in the gene pool. So birds actually live pretty long for their size. There are small birds, songbirds can live up to 10-ish years or so, assuming they're not eaten before then. Mammals of similar size, mice and rats, do you know how long they live? 3, 4 years, maybe. So they're actually, for organisms that have such a high metabolic rate, they're actually reasonably long-lived. Now, if a bird makes it through its first year, You know what the chances are of a bird making it through its first year?
1 in 3.
Less than that.
What?
50-50. About a 50-50 shot of making it through the first year. Well, you know the numbers have to be something like this, or we would be knee deep in birds, right? You know, so a bird makes it about 50-50 shot of making it through the first year. But if it makes it through the first year, it has about an equal chance of dying for every year on for quite some time. You rarely see senescence, aging in birds. And that may well be because as a bird starts to lose it a little bit, it's the next most likely to get eaten because predation is the main end for most birds. Most birds get eaten. But still, you don't really see, birds don't age in the same way that mammals do typically, you know, in the wild. Now, so the critical aspects of populations for birds. You need enough individuals, but not too many individuals, right? That's for a healthy population. If you don't have enough individuals, what problems are you going to have?
Not enough gene pool.
Yes, if you don't have enough individuals and you don't have enough genes, that can reduce the gene pool, and that reduces the basically variability of genes. And it's good to have varied individuals. Why don't you want all your individuals to be genetically identical?
Because then one thing can kill one, they'll kill all of them.
Right. So something big and bad comes along, and if all your individuals are genetically identical, they're going to react to it in the same way, and they can all get wiped out. The whole population goes. Populations are much more stable if there's variation within the gene pool, because then, so something big and bad comes along, some individuals aren't going to make it, but some are. So if the population gets too small, the gene pool starts to narrow down, and you get something that's actually called a bottleneck, a reproductive bottleneck, which means that variation is lost, and that's not a good thing. And also, just if there aren't enough individuals, reproduction is probably not going to go smoothly. Most birds, even just behaviorally, they need a certain population size in order for all those reproduction to be carried out properly. So you have to have enough individuals to keep things stable. What about too many individuals? What happens if you got too many? Yeah. Too many individuals, you're going to have competition for food, you're going to have competition for breeding sites, you're going to have way too much competition. Environments have something called a carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of individuals that can be supported by that particular environment. And if you exceed the carrying capacity, you know what happens?
Starvation.
Yeah. Animals will start to die off. Organisms will die off. If you exceed the carrying capacity, the population will come down again. To some degree, this is not an abnormal thing that you see in populations. Populations go up. If they edge a little bit over carrying capacity, they may come down, then they go up. So populations often tend to kind of oscillate around the carrying capacity, but you can't get too much above it, or there's going to be a problem. So, the key to a healthy population is enough individuals, but not too many individuals. Okay, so just kind of a couple of odds and ends I do want to talk about a little bit when we talk about ecology. I do want to mention migration because that hasn't come up. So migration evolved as a response to variation in the environment. Typically, it's believed that migration started with birds that breed in the north moving southward in order to keep up with the food supply, because breeding is pretty much tied to food supply. How do birds know when to migrate? Well, birds, just like other organisms, have internal clocks and calendars. All right. So those internal clocks and calendars tend to orient to length of day is probably the main thing, but can also respond to other environmental aspects as well. So that tells birds when to go. So So migration varies a little bit. Sometimes male and female birds migrate at different times. In the spring, for example, or in the fall migration, female birds may be a little later leaving because they may still be raising young. In the spring, sometimes males migrate back north a little sooner to get the good territories. So there's a little bit of variation. What's marked on the map here are what are called flyways. And a flyway is a route, basically, that a lot of different species take. So there's a number of different flyways across the country. And migration is a very cool time to be looking for birds, too, because we have birds come through here that we don't see at any other times of the year. We have them going north. We have them, coming back south, in the fall. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun to go out and you can see birds that you don't normally see. And a lot of the range maps will show you where birds go during migration. So you see this bird in the fall, or the winter, you see this bird during migration, you see this bird in the summer, and so forth. So how do they do it? This is a big question that no one has quite answered yet, but it's probably a combination of things. Again, birds have a magnetic sense. Besides the magnetite in their bills, they also have a molecule in their retina called cryptochrome. And with cryptochrome, it's believed they can sense magnetic fields. And they can also sense, birds seem to be able to see polarization. Okay, so light vibrates in all different directions, but we can't really perceive that unless you're wearing polarized sunglasses. Anybody have polarized sunglasses, right? Take your polarized sunglasses like this, and then turn them like that, and you can see the difference in light vibration, different polarizations. And birds can sense that. They look at the sun, and that helps them direct. There are solar cues. And they look at the night sky. Now, the thing about the night sky is they don't look for constellations. They seem to orient on the movement of the night sky. So rather than looking for specific star patterns, they're orienting by the motion. Now, still a lot is not understood about this. Like, how in the world birds can start at one latitude, wind up way at another, and yet manage to navigate back? Because all of those things are different at different latitudes. How do they do it? It's, again, a lot of people are studying that, and it's a really interesting question to, a question to look at. So there's a lot of different cues that they use. Most songbirds migrate at night, which is also why it's important. You may have seen some things about these lights out programs. Mm-hmm. There are things that can disrupt migration, and among those are bright lights at night. It will disrupt it. So a lot of cities and towns and individuals have signed on to the lights out during migration, just to turn lights off at night during the periods of migration so that birds don't get confused and get drawn off course. Because it does happen. Birds get off course sometimes. Yeah?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the magnetic sense in terms of how that works?
Oh, I would love to be able to, but no one really knows. I mean, it's just not well understood. These molecules, they seem to be able to measure a couple of different things. So the magnetic field varies in strength from the poles to the equator. It is the strongest up towards the poles and the weakest towards the equators, which you can think about, if you see the magnetic field, you can think about it as spreading out over the globe. The lines are a lot closer together up high than they are down at the equator. So one of the things that they probably orient by is strength of the magnetic field. But they also seem to be able to do orientation, which is, again, which way is north and which way is south. And, I don't think anyone really understands it. My guess is these iron-containing molecules probably change configuration depending on how they're lined up with the field, because molecules will do that. If they have iron, they can reconfigure. But how that gets processed by the bird brain, that is a great question, and I don't know the answer, and don't know that anybody does. Yeah.
You know, birds are, mammals, not mammals, excuse me, but I mean, they have.
They're vertebrates, yeah.
They're vertebrates, so they have, like the same kind of blood that we have, not like, say, horseshoe crab.
Right.
And we all have so much iron in our blood. Our blood is like pure iron, practically. And how does that also, in addition to that wonderful word, there's magnetite, you said in the top,
Yeah.
the beak.
Yeah.
Is that
So as best I know, no one has ever indicated that that the iron that's bound up in hemoglobin, that's in hemoglobin in our blood, orients with a magnetic field. It's a great question. I don't know that it does. I don't know that it doesn't either. I don't think the interaction of biological matter with magnetic fields has not been studied all that much. So that's a really interesting question. But and the cryptochromes and the retinas, I don't think we have cryptochromes. And I'm not sure exactly how they work either, but if it's typical for the other molecules in the retina, when energy hits them, they undergo a configuration change. But exactly how they work, I don't know. And again, how the bird brain interprets this, I don't really know. But birds do seem to be able to both sense field strength and directionality. So, yeah.
Do you know if any species migrate across the equator, or do they tend to stay in the same hemisphere?
I think if they migrated across the equator, we probably wouldn't call it migration, because birds do undergo what's called dispersal, which is basically sort of movements, along the same latitude. We've defined migration as being, south to north and north to south. But yeah, they move around. They undergo, again, we call it dispersal when they undergo other movements. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of there's probably some local dispersal on a seasonal basis, almost certainly, because, when conditions change with seasonality, it would not be at all unusual for birds to undergo local dispersal from, one area to another. They follow the food. I mean, that's really the key. They follow the food.
But would there be species that would annually, go from South America to North America and back?
Well, yeah, that happens all the time. That's a pretty typical thing. A lot of songbirds that we see pass through here. If you go down to Central America during winter, you'll see them all down there. Mm-hmm. And if you go up north to Canada and the Arctic, you'll see them up there because they're following the food. In the summer, up in the higher latitudes, there's bugs everywhere. So they're up there to get them, and then when those disappear when it gets cold, they're headed back down to the tropics yeah.
I understand there's a big emerging concern about songbirds. I'm going to state it, and I'm asking you to tell me if I've got this right or wrong. Songbirds decide when to migrate based on length of day, position of the sun or the moon, not on temperature and weather. And songbirds, 85% of what they feed their young is insect larvae.
That's correct.
And caterpillars. Whereas insects decide when to breed and create larvae and caterpillars based on temperature. So that I think there's a big concern that the timing could get way off.
Oh.
The birds could migrate and there wouldn't be anything to feed their young.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So with climate change, one of the big concerns is exactly that. That's going to throw these finely tuned schedules out of whack because there are a number of biological processes that are temperature driven. There's a number that are, as you say, photoperiod, day length, and organisms have evolved to adjust so that these things are in sync, and now it's changing. And the key is it's not that it hasn't changed before, because certainly we've had continents moving around, we've had little ice ages, but it's happening too fast. It's happening too quickly for adaptation to occur. So that's part of the question. I mean, if this happened over, hundreds of thousands of years, the change, gradually there would be time for natural selection to gradually change the patterns, change the habitats and such like that. But you're absolutely right. That's a problem. You know, it is a big concern that it is going to throw all kinds of things off. So birds can do this migration. It's very energy intensive. They store fat. If you look at birds right before migration, they store fat under their skin. They store fat in their liver, because this requires a lot of energy. And they fly huge distances, some of them fly huge distances, you know, some not so far. And they do it differently. Some of them do it all in one swoop. Some of them make stopovers on the way. It just varies from species to species.
Do you know, like, which species of bird travels or migrates the longest distance?
I think it's a tern. And I'm not sure what kind of tern, but there are some terns that go, I think, almost from, you know, tip of South America up to the Arctic. And so some of them go really, really long distances. You know, again, huge distances at a crack. Yeah.
So I was wondering about the whole thing with the cicadas, and like, is that increasing the population?
Yes, it is. Oh, the cicadas are a huge bonus for the birds around here. I mean, this is you know, was like a buffet, you know, so absolutely when the cicadas appear, the birds are gonna love it. Lots of food, and you might well see a little bit of a bump in the bird population, which actually brings us to our next. So communities. So what a community is all of the species that live in the same place at the same time. So all of these questions are about how, you know, birds interact with other members of the community. If you're talking about birds alone, ornithologists sometimes call it an assemblage, you know, which is all of the birds that live in the same place at the same time. But if you're looking at all the different species, you're looking at a community. So when ecologists look at communities, the kinds of things they look at species abundance, species richness, which is how many different species there are, and relative abundance, how many of each different species there are. So this is how ecologists characterize a community structure. Let's see how many different species there are out there and how many of each different species there are. Now, the key to think about in thinking about a community is an idea called a niche. So what a niche is, people tend to think about niches as being like an actual physical place in the environment. But it's actually more than that. You can think of niche as being analogous to an actor in a play. The niche is the part that organism plays, the role that organism plays in the environment, in the community. And just like you can't have two actors playing the same part, the same play at the same time, you really can't have two organisms in exactly the same niche in a community, because what will happen is one will win, one will outcompete the other. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have what's called niche overlap, because one organism's niche may well overlap with another one a little bit or a lot, but you really can't have two species doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same community, or again, one or the other, one's going to win and one is going to lose. Now, when you talk about the niche of a species, there are some species that have a very broad niche. They are called generalists. So generalists can live in a lot of different conditions and eat a lot of different things, and they're pretty flexible. You know, they can kind of go with the flow, right? Specialists are very tightly honed in. You know, they only eat certain things and they only live in very, very particular places and such. So a niche could be broad or a niche can be pretty narrow. And One other term that I'll give you, because you may hear this, is you may hear people talk about keystone species. And a keystone species is a member of a community that has a disproportionate impact on the community. You know, it's basically a big player in that community, an important player, sometimes, you know, an abundant player. So you'll hear people talk about keystone species. So when we talk about communities, what we're usually talking about is looking at interactions between the different parts, the different species in the community. And there are different types of interactions. There's three major types. There's competition, there's symbiosis, and there's predation. And most of these are pretty straightforward. So competition, right? So you can have competition within a species. Can you have competition between species? Oh, absolutely. You can have competition within, you can have competition, you know, within a species, for food, for territories, for all sorts of things. So symbiosis. So what symbiosis is long-term interactions between species. And there's different types of symbiosis. Mutualism. So mutualism is when the interaction between the species benefits both species. So they get together, they do something, it's good for everybody. With birds, the best example of mutualism may be mixed flocks. So when you see birds, for those of you that have bird feeders, when birds come around to the feeders, is it just one species at a time?
No,
What do you usually see at feeders around here?
Everybody.
Everybody.
Except something too heavy for.
So which species around here?
Like American goldfinches and
Finches,
Carolina red.
bluebirds, chickadees.
Yes.
Who always comes with the chickadees? Titmice.
Yeah.
So that's the benefit. Can you see the benefit? What would the benefit be of traveling in a mixed flock? Protection is one big benefit, because the more individuals there are of different species, the more likely you are to be alerted if a predator comes around. You know, if the Cooper's hawk is going to take a dive at your feeder, somebody's going to alert everyone. Any other benefits you can think of? So let's say you're a migrant and you're moving through the area. How are you going to know where to find food? You're going to look, a lot of times birds that are not year-round residents will look to the year-round residents to find food, right? You know, everybody follows the chickadees around. The chickadees and the titmice know where the feeders are, they know where the food is, and so that's another benefit. What's the downside of being in a flock, a mixed species flock? Disease is a risk. The more individuals there are together, the bigger the risk of disease. What else? Competition. You know, there's birds can get, well, I'll talk about that in a minute under parasitism, but yeah, you know, there's competition for food, right? So it's a balance. But if you see birds in a mixed flock, what do you know? So it's weighted on the upside, right? You know, if birds are flocking together, it's because it works for them, because it's helping them survive and helping them reproduce. Commensalism, you benefit one, doesn't really do anything for the other. A good example for commensalism in birds, trees. You know, trees provide shelter and such for birds. It doesn't really affect the tree. Most of the time, the tree doesn't care, right? It benefits the bird, but not necessarily the tree. Another example, cattle egrets. Have you seen cattle egrets? So cattle egrets hang around cattle, right? Why do they hang around cattle? They eat the bugs. The cattle walk through, you know, the big herbivores walk around through the grass, they flush stuff out of the grass, and the cattle egrets eat it. The herbivores don't care if the cattle egrets are there, but the cattle egrets definitely get a benefit from association with the herbivores. And the tropics, birds follow ants for the same reason. So ants will go marching across the floor in the tropics, and they will flush stuff out. And there are birds that are literally called ant birds that follow them around. And they eat the stuff that the ants flush out. So those are some examples of commensalism. Parasitism benefits one and harms the other. In birds, the most common example, brood parasitism. You know what brood parasitism is? Somebody was talking about this earlier. You ever hear of brood parasitism?
Is it everybody in the nest?
If I say
Yeah.
cowbirds, what do cowbirds do? They lay their eggs in somebody else's nest. So there's a picture here. There's a robin nest with a cowbird egg in it. So brood parasitism is when cowbirds go around and they lay their eggs in somebody else's nest. So those other birds have to raise their young and feed them and all of that. And cowbirds and other birds that do this, cuckoos do it too. Sometimes those young, they hatch a little earlier than the other birds. They're particularly aggressive. They will sometimes push the other birds out of the nest. They're very, very aggressive. So,
And the parents will come back and check as well.
Yeah.
And if you've interfered with it,
it's,
they will destroy the rest of the nest.
yes. This is one of the things people sometimes ask, should we remove cowbird eggs? And the answer is no. Because if you do that, it is possible that the parents will abandon everything, if the egg is missing. And this is just part of the way that nature works, I mean, that's how it goes. And now, there are defenses against brood parasites. Birds will guard their nest. Because in order to do this, the cowbird's got to get in there and lay the egg. And birds will guard their nest as they are laying. They typically will lay like an egg a day is a fairly reasonable guess. And why don't they lay them all at once? Can't do it. An egg is a really, energy intensive process. And they can't really do that. So they spread it out. But again, most it's on the rate of about an egg a day or so. And parent birds of some species will in fact watch the nest and will guard the nest. There are some birds that will identify the bad egg and boot it out. Not all will do that, but some have some defense for that. So, and they will occasionally, usually by the time it hatches, they're not very good at identifying the odd hatchling out. But so there are some, there's some defenses. Sometimes they will just abandon the nest anyway if they see the cowbird egg. But again, it's all a game of survival. It's sort of a warfare out there, right? The cowbirds have evolved this strategy to survive, and the other birds have evolved protective strategies, to keep the cowbird, egg out. But it's sort of at a balance. The other type of parasitism I was going to talk about is kleptoparasitism. Any guesses as to what kleptoparasitism is? Stealing, not stealing eggs, but stealing food. Kleptoparasitism is when one bird steals food from another. So that's one of the risks of being in a mixed flock is, you might get your food stolen. And if you watch birds for any period of time, you will see kleptoparasitism going on, right? Watch gulls sometime, they are like masters at it. So those are the different types of interactions that you see in a community. I want to talk, question.
So back to gulls for a second. So I've noticed with gulls, if there's a single seagull and you throw it a fish, it will start squawking, and before you know it, there'll be 20 seagulls are fighting for the same fish. So, I mean, seems like it's opposing.
Why does it do that? You would think. Well, I don't know why it does that. That's that's clearly a behavior that's evolved and is productive in some sense, but I don't really know because you would think that it would behoove you to keep your mouth shut, right? If you get food, but survival is also complicated a little bit because sometimes your own survival hinges on survival of your population too. So some behaviors have evolved that are they've been termed altruistic behavior, which is behavior that benefits somebody else and not you, because ultimately in the end it does help pass those genes on. And so there are behaviors that are helpful to the population, maybe more than to the individual, and that particularly holds true for relatives. There's lots of examples in the bird world of birds helping, like first-year birds helping parents raise another set of young, and you can see why that would be evolutionarily favored, because those young are going to share your same genes, right? So it helps those particular genes get passed on. So sometimes behaviors seem like, if this helps this individual, may actually be just beneficial for the population as a whole. Okay. So birds as predators, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Scientists spend a lot of time talking about foraging strategies, how birds get food, because that's, again, the key to so many different things. So birds eat, pretty much you name it. There's birds that are herbivores, birds that are carnivores, birds that are omnivores. They eat seeds, nuts, fruit, insects, fish, mammals, eggs. Other birds, do they eat leaves?
Birds?
Yeah.
They have any teeth.
Why don't they? They don't. Most of them don't. A few do.
I was gonna say, if you kill chickens, they eat leaves.
They won't eat. They can't survive on leaves for most of their diet. Why not? You know why not?
Protein.
It has to do with digestion. What are leaves mostly? Leaves are made of cellulose. So do we digest leaves well? No, we do not, and neither do birds. So there's a few birds that have evolved gut bacteria that help them digest leaves, but most birds don't eat, again, leaves as a big part of the diet. They can't survive because they can't digest them any more than we can. They get digested, to some degree in the gut. And again, few species that do have evolved gut bacteria that do a lot of that, but for the most part, not so much leaves. Now, birds eat a lot because, remember, they've got high metabolism, right? So they're using up a lot of energy all the time, and they're flying, which uses a lot of energy, and they're migrating, which uses a lot of energy. So they eat all the time. And one of the keys for survival is their food has to be available at the appropriate levels for their populations to remain stable. Someone did a study, literally 6,000 to 8,000 caterpillars to raise a brood of chickadees. So that's, one nest of chickadees, 6,000 to 8,000 caterpillars, which emphasizes the dependence of birds on insects and insects being available. Another study estimates birds worldwide eat 550 million tons of insects every year. So, and then insects, of course, depend on native plants for survival, which is why, and we emphasize so much the importance of native plants, because it feeds into everything. The insects eat the plants, the birds eat the insects, and that maintains a healthy population of birds. Now, of course, birds are also prey for other birds. So, they kind of fit into both places on the spectrum. Okay, so we're coming toward the end of our time here. So what I want to finish up with is talking a little bit about threats to birds and what's being done to deal with threats to birds, and what we individuals can do to help with birds. So the most significant anthropogenic threats to the survival of avian species. First of all, most birds are eaten by predators. So we're just sort of taking that out of the picture. That's the sort of the norm for a bird in the world, is it gets eaten by a predator. Anthropogenic threats, well, I've got a chart here just because it was interesting. That shows risks to individual birds. So an individual bird, this bar down here, feral and domestic cats. Cats. For individual birds, feral and domestic cats. Cats are terrible. And, if any of you didn't know this before and have cats that roam outside, you want to help the birds, keep your cats in. Well, because basically what cats are exotic species, right? They're exotic predators. They are not normally a part of this ecosystem. We have imported them, and we've imported them in large numbers. And they do a terrible number on birds. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Building glass. Birds running into windows and such is the next step. Vehicles. Getting hit by cars. All of that. Pesticides. The next one up. Electrical lines, communication towers, electrocution, oil pits, and wind turbines way up there. Pretty small impact. So that's the risks to individual birds. And this is data from, I think it's Fish and Wildlife Service did this survey. So as far as an individual bird goes, besides being eaten by another bird, these are the biggest threats. These are the anthropogenic threats, the ones that we're responsible for. Yeah?
This might be a silly question, but what do the electrical lines do to them?
I'm assuming they get electrocuted from the electrical lines.
But don't they won't when they're sitting on them, so are these just
But
like
if they connect the two.
It would be, a bird would have to have one foot on one line and a foot on something else, which it doesn't happen terribly often because, of course, I mean, we typically don't see, like birds falling off the wires, getting fried, because normally the path through the wire is an easier path than the path through the bird. But if the bird is grounded, if one foot would be grounded, then potentially that. So I would assume that would be what would happen. Now, a different question. This chart shows the risk to individuals, but doesn't talk about bird populations as a whole. And when we look at the whole population, the picture changes just a little bit. And the biggest threat to bird populations as a whole, habitat destruction and habitat fragmentation. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious. Birds have to have the right habitat to live in. Habitat fragmentation is when instead of one big area, you have lots of little areas. So why is that a problem? Why do you think habitat fragmentation is an issue? Let's say you have one big area versus the same square footage, but in a lot of smaller areas.
You're fragmenting the community.
You may get different populations. So you may be negatively impacting the gene flow between those different populations.
And communication.
Yeah, communication, breeding, all those things. And not only that, but when you look at an area, if it's the right kind of habitat, if you look at the edge of that area, it's abutting something else, right? So the edge areas are not necessarily the same. They have different ecological characteristics. Now, one big area has proportionally a lot less edge to it than a lot of small areas. If you get a lot of small areas, you got a lot of edge, which is a lot of territory that may not be exactly what that species needs. So fragmentation is a problem, not only because of negative impacts on reproduction, but also because it produces a lot more edge, which may not be really optimal habitat. But that's the number one problem. Climate change. Here's the climate change thing. So climate change is, again, disrupting the link between food availability and breeding cycles. So again, some things go on temperature, some things go on photoperiod. Those two are diverging a little bit, and that's causing problems. And it's happening so fast that you don't have the usual hundreds of thousands of years for selection to happen and for species to adapt. Yeah.
Is there a rule of thumb for like the size of an area of land that would need to be undisturbed and for it to be natural?
Good question. And it depends on the species. So some species, if you look at species, there are some species that don't require a lot of space, basically. They don't require a lot of territory. Other species require a much larger territory. So when you're looking at that, you have to look at the species and ask the question, what does this species need in order for territory to plan for, a habitat that would be adequate to support it? So yeah, good question. Depends on the species. Introduced predators, again, huge problem. Not just cats, but any kind of invasive species that causes a significant disruption to the environment can potentially disrupt survival of bird populations. Chemical toxicants are a problem. Probably everybody knows the story of DDT, right? DDT had a hormonal effect. It affected the deposition of calcium in eggshells. So the big birds, the heavy birds, would sit on their nest, break the eggshells, and the populations of eagles and ospreys and other big birds of prey went down. Now, the other reason they were affected, there's something called bioconcentration or bioaccumulation. So you spray a pesticide out in the environment and it gets on the bugs. So the bugs that survive but still have some of that pesticide get eaten by little birds, which get eaten by bigger birds, which get eaten, and as you go up, if that pesticide is lipid soluble, it tends to get into the fat tissues and it sticks there. So the concentration, the levels get higher and higher as you go up the food chain. So the first thing that you tend to see affected is the very top of the food chain because they have the highest levels. DDT concentrated something like 1 billion times over between if you measured DDT in the water and DDT in, say, an osprey, it was hugely, hugely concentrated. So pesticides are definitely, chemical toxicants are definitely a problem. Lead is another potential problem. Lead gets into birds, other pesticides, other heavy metals. So all of these things are, potential threats to survival of avian species. Now, what are scientists and policymakers doing about this? Well, one of the first things is to try to document the status of avian populations, and gets back to, this is one thing you can do to help is participate in eBird and all of that, and help people figure out, because you have to figure out what's out there first before you can really do anything about it. You got to figure out what the minimum viable populations are for species, and then priorities have to be set for action. And again, because habitat is the biggest issue, pursuing habitat management, habitat restoration, more and more there's the idea of connecting up networks of preserves, not just for birds, but for other organisms as well, to make sure that there is the ability for gene flow, that there's a big enough contiguous area to support species. Managing exploitation. So back in the day, people used to do, even more of like shooting birds for things like feathers and such, like egrets, and everyone knows the story of the passenger pigeons, right? There used to be, I want to say 6 billion passenger pigeons, or just some, just unbelievable number of passenger pigeons, and they are all gone because they were shot. They were all shot for food. So trying to manage the exploitation of species, typically for a lot of species, this is through treaties, agreement not to buy and sell, to engage in commerce with endangered species and so forth. Strategic breeding, captive raising and reintroduction. For some, when populations drop enough, the strategy has been to take some of those individuals, take them into captivity, breed them with the hope that we'll be able to release them later. And this has actually worked for a number of species, or it is working for a number of species. Some of the species that have been assisted with this, California condor is one, whooping cranes, okay? They've taken some of the whooping crane population, not only did they breed them in captivity, but they were using ultralights to help guide them on migration to try to get a flock established again. Peregrine falcons. So there's been a number of species where this has been employed. And most zoos, not just for birds, but for other species as well, have gotten much more into the idea of planning for breeding and reintroduction and having a plan for this. Eliminating introduced predators and other disruptive invasive species, again, can help. Now, there is the risk with all of this of developing what's sometimes called a conservation-reliant species, which is a species that depends on human intervention for survival. And that's not optimal, but that's better than extinction. And what can you do? So the things that you can do, go birding. Invite other people to go birding, kids especially, because birding for a lot of people is the gateway into caring about the environment. And you can't get people to do anything about anything if they don't care. So getting people out there, birds are fun. They're, whether you're just a casual birder or whether you get into the whole life list thing. So how many of you as kids did the Pokemon card thing? Quite a few, probably. This is almost like Pokemon cards for adults, right? Doing a life list, right? Because you get a list and you get to check things off, and so a lot of people really, really get into that, and it's fun and challenging to go out looking for birds. But the big key is you got to get people out there to care, to get them to care, to get them to make a difference. So going birding, and it's good for your health too. A lot of studies have shown that getting people outdoors and doing things outdoors does good things. It lowers blood pressure, it reduces anxiety, it does all sorts of good things. You can also practice backyard conservation on your own property. Things we've already talked about, planting native species, for example. Providing good habitat for birds. Keep your cats indoors. Protect the birds that way. Supporting citizen science, reporting what you see on eBird, doing the surveys, feeder watch, Christmas bird count, everything else. Making ecologically sound consumer choices, and supporting sustainability, and investing your time and money in conservation efforts. You can donate to conservation groups, and you can also participate in grassroots activism. There's a lot of groups around here who do activism for conservation. I know the New Hope Bird Alliance does a advocacy day, goes up to the state capitol once every year to talk about issues, typically about habitat conservation and all of that. So there's plenty of opportunities to do that. Okay, so wrapping all of this up. If you don't remember anything else, and I know I've told you a lot of detail, again, I will post the slides, so you will have all of that information. But if you can only remember two things, I want you to think about things in terms of both natural selection and the ecosystem, because everything you see out there, if you see it, the characteristics and the behavior, you're seeing it because it has worked for that species in that environment and that's helped that species to reproduce. So the answer to the question, why is it doing that, is almost always because it helped it survive, right? Then it's up to scientists to figure out how it helped it survive, but still, if you see it, it's because it's been working for that particular organism. And the other thing to remember, everything is connected through food webs, through community interactions. Everything is connected. So you cannot just go in and pull one thing out and say, oh, well, this won't change anything else. It will change everything. Taking things away, adding things in, everything is connected. And sometimes in ways you can't predict. So this is one of the reasons why, for ecologists, modeling an ecosystem is so tricky, because it's huge. There are so many things out there and so many different connections, and they are all interrelated. So as you go out there as master naturalist, think about that stuff. Remember that everything you see is there because it works, and it's all connected together. All of those pressures from the rest of the environment are feed into the genetics, which feeds back into that, and so it's a complex world. Okay, now, yeah, questions?
Are there any birds that are considered invasive species, like,
Sure.
plants and so we got the Asian nuthatch or something that's over here?
Great question. So we have starlings over here. We have house finches over here. We have house sparrows over here. Sure, there's a lot of birds that have been moved around from one place to another. Now, sometimes that happens naturally. Birds move themselves. Cattle egrets have moved themselves. Cattle egrets have done it on their own. I don't think anybody has helped cattle egrets move, but they've just done it. And in some species, some non-native species, for long enough, if they're long enough, they develop their own niche. And so some are more, and it's the same with plants, and it's the same with insects, and some are more damaging than others, depending on how they interact with the system. But absolutely, there are birds that are. Yeah.
So I think I might know the answer to this question now after this presentation, but we used to live in a neighborhood, tighter lots, that kind of thing, and we had bird feeders and habitat and everything, and the birds were great. Then we moved to a larger property, wooded, and the birds were everywhere when we moved there. I felt like we kind of moved into their backyard, and my gut has said, don't feed them, they don't need you to, leave them alone, let them do their own thing. But every once in a while I question if I shouldn't.
It's okay if you feed them. Studies have shown that even if you feed birds, even if they have access to feeders, they still get about 70% of their food from someplace else. And people worry about this, and there is not really any evidence that your feeders are having a huge impact.
I just wanted to comment on that. Maybe not so much on the food itself, but you have to be mindful that when you have feeders, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to outdoor stuff. I don't have feeders because I don't want to clean them.
Yeah.
They carry disease, they add to disease spread when there's things like outbreaks of bird flu and things like that. So if you do have feeders, you have to clean them regularly and be very careful about what you're feeding the birds. Like I've seen stuff on Facebook like take lard and add all this stuff to it and leave it outside, and I'm like, no, please don't do that.
Yeah,
The best bird feeder is native plants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Native plants is good, but again, you can put a feeder up, and as long as you keep it clean, maintain it well, use appropriate food, you are not going to. I mean, people sometimes worry about hummingbirds. Oh, if I put a feeder up, will they not migrate? No, they'll migrate. They'll do it anyway. And
so one other question to get feedback on it. So we've been shocked at the way that the land and the biodiversity takes care of itself. Like we have no mosquitoes, none. We see the insect, everything's working together nicely. And I just am like, we already cleared out part of their habitat. I'm scared to do anything else. And
as long as it's good to be mindful of what the birds need and make sure you leave plenty of what they need. And it sounds like you're doing that. So now you've got one more assignment before you leave, and that's for each group. I want you to come up with some questions. So just the last couple of minutes here, get together quick in your group, and I want every group to come up with like 2 or 3 questions of things we didn't get to cover, but that you would like to know. And then you're going to turn them in, and then we'll be done.